Hey guys, tonight we're diving into a historical slumber party, if you will, focusing on a topic that might just send a shiver down your spine. How medieval peasants, those sturdy, salt-of-the-earth folks, actually survived the bone-chilling cold of winter. Imagine, for a moment, that you're not nestled in your warm bed, perhaps with a soft blanket and a perfectly regulated thermostat. No. Tonight, you're transported back. You feel the damp, earthy floor beneath your bare feet, the straw rustling as you shift, and a biting draft snaking its way through cracks in the wattle and daub walls. The air, thick with the smell of wood smoke and damp wool, clings to you. Outside, the wind howls a mournful tune, carrying with it the promise of frost and snow. You pull your threadbare tunic tighter, your breath misting in the dim light cast by a sputtering rushlight. The thought of venturing out, even for a moment, seems utterly preposterous. You probably wouldn't survive this. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, if you're listening, drop a comment with your location and local time. It's always wild to see where everyone is tuning in from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're a medieval peasant. Let's call you Thomas, or maybe Alara. It's late autumn, and the air already carries a crisp, biting edge that promises a truly harsh winter. The sun, when it bothers to show its face, seems to hang low in the sky, offering little warmth. You watch as your breath plumes in front of you, a fleeting cloud in the already heavy air. This isn't just a bit nippy, mind you. This is a cold that seeps into your bones, a constant, gnawing presence that dictates every single waking moment. We're talking about winters that could easily last for months, with temperatures consistently below freezing. Forget your modern forecasts. These folks had only the aching in their joints and the wisdom passed down through generations to tell them what was coming. The sheer, relentless nature of the cold was a primary threat to life, right up there with famine and plague. A mainstream historical fact often overlooked is that the Little Ice Age, a period of global cooling, was in full swing during much of the late medieval period, roughly from the 13th to the mid-19th century. This meant colder, longer winters and cooler, wetter summers, making agricultural life incredibly precarious. Imagine, if you will, living through multiple decades where the growing season was shorter and the harvest often diminished by unexpected frosts. This wasn't just an inconvenience. It was a matter of life and death, directly impacting how much food you had, and therefore, how much energy your body could generate to stay warm. Now, for a quirkier tidbit. Medieval folk, lacking our understanding of meteorology, often looked to animals for signs of the coming winter. There was a belief that if pigs carried a lot of straw in their mouths, it foretold a severe winter, as they were supposedly preparing extra bedding for themselves. Similarly, the thickness of an animal's coat was often seen as an indicator. While adorable, these observations were, of course, far from scientific, but they offered a simple, observable way to gauge the impending chill. You might find yourself watching the local hogs with a peculiar intensity, hoping they weren't building too grand a nest. Historians still argue whether the Little Ice Age's impact was uniformly devastating across all regions of Europe, or if localized microclimates and specific agricultural practices allowed some communities to fare better than others. But for you, poor Thomas or Alara, living in your humble village, the cold was a universal truth. You felt it in your fingers as you mended a fishing net, in your toes as you trudged to the well for water, and in your very core as the short winter days faded into the long, dark nights. This wasn't just discomfort. This was a physiological battle against hypothermia, frostbite, and the slow, insidious drain on your body's resources. Every breath was a calculation. Every movement a consideration of energy expenditure versus the need to stay active enough to keep the blood flowing. The cold was a character in your daily drama, a silent, pervasive antagonist that you could never truly escape. Now, let's imagine you've finally retreated from the biting wind and stepped inside your home. You probably picture a cozy, perhaps rustic, cottage, right? Well, prepare for a dose of medieval reality. Your home, as a peasant, is likely a small, single-room dwelling, what historians often refer to as a crofter's cottage or a hovel. It's constructed primarily from local materials, meaning whatever was most readily available. So, you're looking at wattle and daub for the walls. That's a lattice of interwoven wooden strips, or wattle, plastered with a sticky mix of wet soil, clay, straw, animal dung, and sometimes sand, known as daub. It's surprisingly sturdy for its time, but let's be honest, it's not exactly known for its insulating properties. It's effective against a direct gust, certainly, but thermal efficiency? Not so much. The roof would likely be thatched, layers of straw, reeds, or heather tightly bound together. Thatching provides a decent waterproof barrier, but again, insulation is secondary. And those charming little windows you see in storybooks? Forget them. Your home probably has, at best, a small opening, perhaps covered with a wooden shutter or even a piece of stretched animal bladder to let in a sliver of diffuse light. Glass was an unimaginable luxury, reserved for cathedrals and castles. So, natural light is minimal and drafts are plentiful. You can feel the cold seeping through the daub, finding every tiny crack in the ancient plaster. It's a constant, uphill battle against the elements, even within the supposed sanctuary of your own walls. The central feature, the absolute heart of your home, is the hearth. This isn't some fancy brick fireplace with a chimney that efficiently vents smoke. No, your hearth is often just a stone-lined depression in the middle of the earthen floor, or perhaps a simple raised platform. A fire burns there, constantly, hopefully. The smoke from this fire, rather than being neatly whisked away by a chimney, often just drifts upwards, permeates the thatched roof, and eventually finds its way out through a hole in the roof or simply through gaps in the thatch. This lack of proper ventilation means your home is almost perpetually filled with a haze of acrid smoke, which, while providing a certain smoky warmth and charring any airborne bacteria, which might actually be a fringe benefit, come to think of it, also coats everything in a layer of soot and can cause chronic respiratory issues. Imagine going to sleep every night with burning eyes and a cough that just won't quit. Makes you appreciate your clean air filters, doesn't it? A mainstream historical fact here is that chimneys, as we understand them today, were a later medieval innovation and primarily a feature of wealthier homes and castles, not peasant cottages. Before chimneys became widespread, the smoke-filled environment was simply the norm for most people. It was a trade-off, warmth for smoky lungs. You learn to live with the perpetual scent of wood smoke clinging to your clothes, your hair, everything. It's the smell of survival. For a quirky tidbit, some peasant homes, particularly in colder regions, would incorporate animal stalls directly adjoining their living space. So, imagine your pig, or perhaps a cow or a few sheep, not just next door, but literally sharing a wall, or even the same roof. The idea was that the body heat from these animals would contribute to the overall warmth of the dwelling. It might sound strange to us, but when every degree counts, a bovine furnace is a welcome addition, even if it comes with its own unique set of aromas and cleaning challenges. Historians still argue whether the primary motivation for this cohabitation was for animal warmth, or simply for better security against theft and predators, or perhaps a combination of both practicalities. But you, as a medieval peasant, aren't debating the finer points of architectural history. You're just grateful for that extra bit of generated warmth that helps take the edge off the bitter cold night. The low hum of the cow chewing its cud in the dark, the occasional snort from the pig. These are the sounds of your internal heating system, albeit a rather smelly one. You find yourself instinctively moving closer to the hearth, even if the smoke makes your eyes water. There's a certain primal comfort in watching the flames dance, a small island of light and heat in the vast, encroaching darkness and cold. You can feel the draft still, seeping in from cracks around the ill-fitting door, whispering through the thatched roof. The walls, despite their thick daub, feel cold to the touch. You might even pile straw or dry leaves against the inside of the walls to try and create a meager insulation layer. Every little bit helps. Every small effort to trap that precious, fleeting warmth. The struggle to keep the cold at bay is constant, even inside your own home. It's not a place you escape to for warmth, so much as a place where the fight against the cold continues, just with slightly better odds. With your smoky, drafty dwelling as your primary defense, the next crucial weapon in your fight against the medieval chill is fuel. And let me tell you, for a peasant, Fuel isn't just about throwing another log on the fire. It's a strategic resource, a constant calculation, and often a matter of life and death. You don't have a local gas station or a delivery service for neatly cut firewood. Every twig, every branch, every lump of dried dung is a potential source of warmth, and it must be collected painstakingly by your own hand. Your primary fuel source, of course, is wood, but not just any wood. You're not chopping down majestic oak trees for your personal hearth. Those are reserved for lords, for building, for ships. Your wood comes from what's available and permissible: fallen branches, dead wood from the forests, scrub brush, and perhaps, if you're lucky, some coppiced wood, smaller trees that were specifically managed to grow straight, thin poles for regular harvesting. This often means long, arduous treks into communal woodlands or along riverbanks, gathering every usable scrap. Imagine spending an entire day in the biting cold, your hands numb, your back aching, just to gather enough fuel for a few days' warmth. It's a labor-intensive, never-ending chore. And it's not just the gathering. You also have to transport it back to your hovel, often on your own back or with a simple handcart, a process that can take hours. Beyond wood, medieval peasants were incredibly resourceful. You might gather peat if you lived near bogs or marshlands. Peat is essentially decomposed plant matter, dug out in blocks, dried, and then burned. It burns slowly, consistently, and with a rather distinctive earthy smell, but it's a good, steady heat source. If peat wasn't available, or even if it was, you'd be collecting other less conventional fuels. Dried animal dung, particularly from cows or horses, was a common and valuable fuel source, especially in areas where wood was scarce. You'd carefully collect it from the fields, shape it into patties, and let it dry in the sun, turning it into surprisingly effective, slow-burning fuel. It might not smell like roses, but when you're shivering, a warm, if slightly malodorous, glow is infinitely preferable to nothing at all. You might even gather heather or other tough, woody plants, binding them into bundles to burn. Every combustible item was a potential contributor to your survival. A mainstream historical fact is that access to woodlands and common land for foraging and fuel collection was a frequent point of contention and legal dispute between peasants and their feudal lords. While peasants generally had customary rights to collect deadwood, these rights were often challenged or restricted by lords who wanted to preserve timber for their own use or for sale. This meant that simply gathering fuel wasn't just physical labor. It was often a negotiation of rights, a careful dance to avoid the wrath of the local lord's bailiff. Imagine the anxiety of potentially being caught gathering a branch deemed too large or from an off-limits area. For a quirky tidbit, some peasant communities would practice fire watching in shifts, especially during the deepest parts of winter nights. This wasn't just about safety. It was to ensure that the precious fire didn't go out. Reigniting a fire in medieval times was no simple task. You didn't have matches or lighters. It involved carefully nursing embers, using a tinderbox with flint and steel, or even borrowing a hot coal from a neighbor, a literal live coal delivery service. The idea of your fire dying out overnight was a minor catastrophe, plunging you into darkness and rapidly escalating cold, requiring a significant effort to restart it. Historians still argue whether the common rights to resources like wood and pasture were a benevolent provision by lords or a pragmatic necessity to ensure the survival of the labor force that sustained the feudal system. Regardless, for you, sitting by your hearth, watching the flames devour your hard-won fuel, it's a constant, palpable awareness of scarcity. You learn to husband your resources, to make every twig count, to bank the embers carefully at night so you don't have to start from scratch in the morning. You become an expert in the burn rate of different materials and how to arrange logs to maximize heat output and longevity. There's a certain grim satisfaction in seeing the flames dance, knowing that you, through your own toil, have conjured this precious warmth from the unforgiving landscape. It's a small victory against the overwhelming force of winter. All right, you've got your drafty home and your hard-won fuel. Now, let's talk about what you wear, because your clothing isn't just about modesty or looking good for the village gossip. It's a crucial layer of defense against the relentless cold. Forget your breathable synthetics or your sleek, lightweight down jackets. Medieval peasant fashion is all about practicality, durability, And most importantly, layering. You might not have much, but what you do have, you wear, often all at once. Your basic garment, for both men and women, is the tunic or shift. This is a simple, long-sleeved garment, often made of linen or hemp in the warmer months. But for winter, you'd want something thicker, likely a coarse, scratchy wool. Wool, even undyed and rough, is a fantastic insulator when dry, trapping air between its fibers to keep you warm. You'd probably have several of these, wearing them one on top of the other. Imagine the feeling, a constant, faint itch against your skin, a testament to the raw, unprocessed nature of the fabric. Over your tunic, you'd wear another layer, perhaps a blouse or a jerkin for men, or a kirtle for women. Again, wool is the material of choice. These garments are often belted to keep them close to the body, trapping more warmth. For your legs, you'd have brays, loose trousers, or stockings/hose, which might be made of wool or even leather. These would be tied to your belt or to a separate waistband to keep them up. Imagine trying to walk through snow with your trousers constantly slipping down. Not ideal. Footwear would be simple leather turn shoes or boots, often unlined, offering little in the way of insulation from the frozen ground. You might stuff straw or dry grass into them for a bit of extra padding and warmth, a primitive form of insulation that, while temporary, could make a significant difference on a long, cold day. When you venture outside, the real layering begins. You'd pull on a cloak or a mantle. This is your all-weather, all-purpose outer garment, often a large piece of heavy wool fabric, perhaps with a hood. It's not tailored. It's essentially a blanket that you wrap around yourself, fastening it with a simple brooch or tie. This cloak serves as your shield against the wind, the rain, and the snow. You become adept at wrapping it just so, creating a snug cocoon of coarse wool. A mainstream historical fact is that dyeing clothing, especially with vibrant, fast colors, was an expensive and complex process in the medieval period, often requiring specialized knowledge and rare materials. Therefore, most peasant clothing would have been undyed, appearing in the natural colors of the fibers, grays, browns, and off-whites of wool and linen. If there was color, it would likely be muted, derived from common plant dyes, making for a rather drab wardrobe by modern standards. But you're not worried about fashion trends, you're worried about frostbite. For a quirky tidbit, some medieval medical texts actually recommend stuffing wool or even hot sand into mittens or shoes as a way to ward off extreme cold. While the sand would quickly cool, the concept shows a basic understanding of external heat application. And the wool, well, that's just good sense, adding extra insulation to your often ill-fitting and poorly insulated footwear. You might even find yourself stuffing your hat with extra wool or straw if your ears are aching from the wind, looking less like a fashion icon and more like a walking haystack, but feeling a little less frozen. Historians still argue whether the apparent uniformity in peasant clothing across various regions was primarily due to limited access to materials and technology, or if there were more subtle, unrecorded regional variations in style and layering techniques. But for you, the individual peasant, the mantra is simple: more layers, more warmth. You sleep in many of the same clothes you wear during the day. Adding extra blankets made of animal hides or more rough will if you're fortunate enough to possess them. You might even pull your cloak over you as an additional cover. Getting dressed in the morning isn't about choosing an outfit. It's about shrugging on the familiar, slightly damp, constantly itchy layers that stand between you and the frigid air. The smell of sheep, sweat, and wood smoke is your personal perfume, a constant reminder of your daily struggle to simply stay warm. It's a functional uniform, a silent declaration that you are, first and foremost, a survivor of the cold. So you're dressed in your layers of rough wool, the smoke from the hearth stinging your eyes, but you're still feeling that pervasive chill. This is where communal warmth truly comes into play. For medieval peasants, survival wasn't just an individual struggle. It was a collective effort, and sharing heat, both literally and figuratively, was a cornerstone of that strategy. You see, an isolated fire in a single hovel, no matter how carefully tended, could only do so much. The real trick was to combine warmth, to huddle together, and to leverage the collective body heat of many. Imagine the village common house, or perhaps the local tavern, if one existed and you could afford the occasional ale. These places weren't just social hubs. They were literal warm spots, larger buildings that could accommodate bigger fires and more people. On the coldest nights, you might find yourself gravitating towards such a place, not just for company, but for the sheer radiative heat of dozens of bodies pressed together. Think of it as an early form of human-powered central heating. The laughter, the storytelling, the simple act of breathing in a shared space, all contributed to a microclimate that was measurably warmer than the frigid outdoors or your own drafty home. Then there's the family bed. While we might cherish our individual sleeping arrangements today, for medieval peasants, it was common for entire families to sleep together in one large bed, or on a communal straw palliasse, a mattress stuffed with straw or leaves, on the floor. This wasn't just about limited space, it was a deliberate strategy for warmth. The body heat of multiple people snuggled together, especially under shared animal hides or rough wool blankets, was significantly more effective than trying to keep warm alone. You'd have siblings, parents, maybe even grandparents all piled together, creating a natural incubator against the biting cold. It might sound a bit like a medieval sleepover, but with much higher stakes. A mainstream historical fact is that medieval village life was intrinsically communal, far more so than modern individualistic societies. Resources were often shared. Labor was frequently collective, like during harvest or for large building projects, and hardships were borne together. This extended to strategies for staying warm, where the line between private and public space, and indeed, between individual and collective survival, was much blurrier. You relied on your neighbors, and they relied on you, not just for help with a broken fence, but for the literal warmth of their presence. For a quirky tidbit, there's evidence that some medieval communities, particularly in more severe climates, would engage in communal winter feasts or gatherings specifically designed to burn large quantities of wood. These weren't just celebrations, they were pragmatic energy expenditures. Imagine a giant bonfire in the village square, where everyone contributed fuel and shared the warmth, a temporary hub of intense heat that warmed spirits as much as bodies. It's a bit like a medieval block party, but the guest of honor is a massive pile of burning wood, and the main goal is to not freeze. Historians still argue whether the close-knit social structures of medieval peasant communities were primarily a response to economic necessity and survival challenges, or if they reflected a deeper cultural preference for collective living. But for you, as a medieval peasant, these communal bonds are a lifeline. You might gather with neighbors to mend tools near a shared fire, or simply sit in the dim light of the tavern, sipping a thin ale, feeling the radiated heat from the bodies around you. The cacophony of voices, the occasional burst of laughter, the shared silence, all of it contributes to a sense of warmth that transcends the physical. It's the warmth of solidarity, of knowing you're not facing the unforgiving winter alone. You feel the collective breath of the room, the shared exhalations creating a subtle, humid warmth that momentarily defeats the outside chill. This collective hum of humanity is perhaps the most comforting sound on a truly frigid night. Speaking of communal warmth, let's talk about your four-legged housemates. Yes, you heard that right. While it might seem odd to us with our climate-controlled homes and designated pet areas, for a medieval peasant, animals weren't just a source of food or labor. They were often living, breathing, fur-covered radiators. Integrating livestock into the home was a surprisingly common and highly effective strategy for surviving the coldest nights. Imagine stepping into your dwelling on a particularly bitter evening. Instead of just your family, you might find a cow, a few sheep, or even your pig sharing a portion of your single-room hovel. These animals weren't just visitors. They were often pinned in a section of the house, perhaps separated by a low wall or a simple barrier, but still very much inside the main living space. Why? Because a living, breathing animal generates a significant amount of body heat. A cow, for instance, produces quite a lot of warmth. It's essentially a biological furnace, constantly radiating heat into the surrounding air. Multiply that by several animals, and you've got a noticeable rise in ambient temperature, especially in a small, enclosed space. This practice, known as byre dwelling, from byre, meaning a cowshed, was particularly prevalent in northern European regions and mountainous areas where winters were especially harsh and sustained warmth was paramount. It was a pragmatic solution born of necessity. Not only did the animals provide warmth, but their presence also offered security against theft and predators and made it easier to tend to them during severe weather. You wouldn't have to venture out into a blizzard to check on your valuable livestock if they were just a few feet away. And let's not forget the added benefit of easily collecting their valuable dung for fuel or fertilizer right there in the relative warmth of your home. A mainstream historical fact here is that multi-purpose dwellings, combining human and animal habitation, were a characteristic feature of peasant architecture across many parts of Europe for centuries. The concept of a separate barn or stable as we know it today was often a luxury or a later development. The idea was to maximize efficiency and resourcefulness, intertwining all aspects of peasant life within a single structure. It reflects a very different relationship between humans and animals than what we are accustomed to. Now, for a quirky tidbit. Beyond the practical benefits, some folklore suggested that certain animals, particularly pigs, had a special ability to sniff out bad weather. While this is certainly not scientifically accurate, the idea of these animals providing warmth and acting as weather forecasters, however unreliable, adds a charming layer to their presence in the home. You might find yourself observing your pig with newfound interest, wondering if its grunts or nesting habits held any clues about the next cold snap. Historians still argue whether the perceived benefits of animal companionship, beyond sheer utility, played a significant role in fostering these cohabitation practices, or if it was purely a utilitarian decision. But for you, the peasant, the gentle snuffling of your cow in the corner, the rhythmic chewing, perhaps even the occasional soft moo, are more than just noises. They're the sounds of your heating system, working tirelessly through the night. Of course, living with animals comes with its own set of challenges. The smell, for one, would be omnipresent and pungent. Hygiene would be a constant struggle, with flies and parasites being an unfortunate reality. But when the alternative is potentially freezing to death, these are minor inconveniences. You'd become accustomed to the earthy scent, the rustling of straw as an animal shifts, the subtle warmth radiating from their large bodies. It's a raw, elemental kind of comfort, a reminder that survival sometimes means embracing unconventional solutions. You learn to live with the smells, the sounds, the occasional mess. Because, frankly, the warmth they provide is priceless. It's a constant, living heat source, far more reliable and long-lasting than your dwindling pile of firewood. You might even find yourself leaning against the cow's flank on a particularly cold morning, just for that extra boost of warmth before facing the bitter outside world. With your animal roommates radiating warmth, you still need to generate heat from within. And that, dear listener, brings us to the surprisingly critical topic of medieval peasant diet. Forget your trendy health shakes and calorie-counting apps. For a medieval peasant, every single bite of food was a direct contribution to your internal furnace, a fuel source to keep your body temperature up and your organs functioning in the face of relentless cold. Your diet, quite frankly, would be heavy on carbohydrates and fats, designed for energy and insulation, not for a beach body. Your staples would be things like dark bread made from rye, barley, or oats, coarse, dense, and incredibly filling. This bread wasn't sliced white bread. It was often a hard, heavy loaf that provided sustained energy release. You'd probably consume large quantities of it every single day. Along with bread, pottage would be a cornerstone of almost every meal. Pottage is essentially a thick, savory porridge or stew, made from whatever grains, legumes, and vegetables were available. Oats, peas, beans, cabbage, onions, leeks, and root vegetables like parsnips or carrots, if you were lucky. It would be simmered slowly over the hearth, providing a warm, comforting, and nutrient-dense meal that was easy to digest and packed with calories. Meat was a luxury for most peasants, certainly not an everyday occurrence. If you ate meat, it would likely be from smaller animals you might keep, like chickens or pigs, or from occasional hunting or poaching, a risky business indeed. More commonly, you'd rely on dairy products like milk, cheese, and butter if you had a cow or goats. These provided essential fats and proteins. Fish, especially salted or dried, would also be a crucial protein source if you lived near a river or the coast. But the emphasis remained on high-energy, starchy foods that could be grown or gathered locally and stored through the winter. A mainstream historical fact often overlooked is that medieval peasant diets, while seemingly bland to us, were often nutritionally adequate for their demanding physical lives, providing the calories needed for hard labor and staying warm. Deficiencies, when they occurred, were usually due to famine or prolonged periods of scarcity, not typically from the everyday diet, which was optimized for survival. They might not have had the variety we enjoy, but what they ate was designed for purpose. For a quirky tidbit, there's evidence that peasants in some regions would drink large quantities of thin ale or cider throughout the day, even children. This wasn't just for enjoyment. The brewing process made it safer to drink than often contaminated water, and the small caloric content provided a minor energy boost. Plus, the slight alcoholic content would have a warming effect, however fleeting. Imagine starting your day with a tankard of weak ale, thinking it's your morning coffee. Certainly a different kind of caffeine rush. Historians still argue whether the prevalence of ale consumption was more about avoiding waterborne diseases, or if it was also a significant, albeit small, source of daily calories and a morale booster in harsh conditions. But for you, the medieval peasant, chewing on that dense bread and spooning down warm pottage, you feel the immediate effect, a slow, steady warmth spreading through your stomach, fueling your core. It's not a sudden burst, but a sustained internal combustion. You learn to appreciate every single mouthful, knowing it's not just food, it's life itself, converting into precious degrees of body heat. You might even find yourself dreaming of a particularly hearty stew on a truly cold night, the imagined steam warming your face, the richness a luxurious thought. Every meal is a victory against the encroaching chill, a small, satisfying rebellion against the elements. As the short, dim winter day fades into the long, inky night, your medieval peasant self faces perhaps the greatest challenge of all, bedtime. This isn't about slipping under a duvet. It's a strategic maneuver, a carefully orchestrated series of rituals designed to trap what little warmth you've managed to accumulate and carry it through the frigid hours until dawn. First, your bed. It's unlikely you have a raised bed frame, certainly not one with springs. More likely, you're sleeping on a straw palliasse or a rough mattress stuffed with dried leaves or bracken, laid directly on the earthen floor. This provides a modicum of insulation from the cold, damp ground, but it's far from luxurious. You might pile extra straw or rushes around the sleeping area, creating a sort of nest to further buffer against drafts. Remember those layers of wool clothing? You probably don't take them off. You sleep in most, if not all, of your day clothes, adding extra tunics or even your heavy cloak as additional blankets. Every fiber, every thread, is pressed into service. Then there's the communal aspect again. As mentioned before, the entire family would often huddle together in the same sleeping area, sharing body heat. Imagine the tangle of limbs, the shared breath, the subtle warmth radiating from each person. It's an intimate, if unglamorous, form of central heating. You might even pull a large animal hide over everyone, perhaps a deerskin or a sheepskin, adding another layer of crude but effective insulation. The goal is to create a human-animal fabric cocoon, trapping as much warmth as possible within a small volume of air. A mainstream historical fact here is that privacy, as we understand it today, was largely non-existent for medieval peasants. Living in single-room dwellings with multiple family members, often including animals, meant that personal space was a concept yet to be invented. Bedtime was a shared experience, driven by necessity rather than choice. Now, for a quirky tidbit, some peasants would even use warm stones as a sort of medieval hot water bottle. You might heat a flat stone by the fire, wrap it in a cloth or straw to prevent burns, and then slip it under your shared bedding. It wouldn't stay warm for long, but those initial hours of radiated heat could be a small comfort against the encroaching chill. Imagine the quiet scramble to get to the warmest spot, closest to the stone, or tucked deepest within the family huddle. Historians still argue whether the apparent lack of attention to personal hygiene during the medieval period was solely due to a lack of understanding of germ theory, or if the sheer difficulty of heating water and the constant battle against cold made frequent bathing an impractical luxury for most peasants. Regardless, you're less concerned about smelling fresh and more concerned about being frostbitten. The hearth, your constant companion, would be carefully banked before you settled down. Embers would be covered with ash, meant to smolder slowly through the night, providing a tiny, faint glow and the hope of an easy rekindling in the morning. This isn't just about saving fuel. It's about having a ready source of fire when you wake, because starting a new fire in the dark and cold of pre-dawn is a truly miserable task. You can feel the heat diminishing as the hours pass, the subtle shift in the air temperature inside your hovel, a creeping cold that slowly reclaims the space. You might wake in the middle of the night, shivering, pulling your cloak tighter, trying to curl into an even tighter ball, instinctively seeking the warmth of your family members beside you. Every breath you take in the still, cold air is visible, a small cloud disappearing into the darkness above. The night stretches long, a silent testament to the resilience required simply to survive until morning light, when the cycle of warmth-seeking would begin anew. Even with all your ingenious strategies, the smoky hovel, the endless layers of wool, the animal furnaces, the dense pottage, and the communal sleeping arrangements, the medieval winter still brought with it a host of relentless dangers beyond just the simple chill. This wasn't just about feeling uncomfortable. It was about the insidious, slow creep of health crises that could easily claim lives. The most obvious danger, of course, was hypothermia. This isn't just being cold. It's when your body loses heat faster than it can produce it, leading to a dangerously low core body temperature. For a medieval peasant, constantly exposed to damp, cold conditions, often with inadequate food or rest, hypothermia was a very real, ever-present threat. Even a mild case could lead to confusion, clumsiness, and impaired judgment, making simple tasks like tending the fire or gathering wood incredibly risky. A slip, a fall, or a moment of disorientation could easily become fatal in a landscape where help was far away and conditions unforgiving. Then there was frostbite. Imagine your fingers and toes, constantly exposed, constantly working in the cold. Frostbite occurs when body tissue actually freezes, leading to loss of feeling, discoloration, and in severe cases, tissue death. Without modern medical care, a severe case of frostbite often meant amputation, performed with crude instruments and no anesthesia, if it didn't simply lead to gangrene and a slow, agonizing death. You'd probably see many villagers with missing digits or scarred, disfigured limbs, silent testimonies to the winter's brutal toll. Beyond the immediate cold-related injuries, the winter brought a surge in respiratory illnesses. Remember the smoky air in your hovel? That constant inhalation of particulate matter, combined with damp, cold conditions, and often poor nutrition, made you highly susceptible to coughs, bronchitis, pneumonia, and other lung ailments. A simple cold could quickly escalate into something far more severe, especially for the very young, the very old, or anyone already weakened by hunger or other illnesses. You'd hear a chorus of hacking coughs throughout the village, a constant reminder of the unseen enemy lurking in the air. A mainstream historical fact is that infant and child mortality rates were extremely high in the medieval period, often exceeding 30 to 50% before the age of 5. While many factors contributed to this, the harshness of winter, with its increased risk of cold exposure, respiratory infections, and scarcity of adequate food, undoubtedly played a significant role in these grim statistics. It was a constant heartbreak for families, seeing so many of their little ones succumb to the unseen dangers of the season. For a quirky tidbit, some medieval remedies for coughs and colds involved rather unusual ingredients. You might be told to drink a concoction of boiled nettles or leeks, or even to apply a plaster made of pigeon dung and honey to your chest. While the honey might have had some soothing properties, the efficacy of the other ingredients is certainly debatable. Imagine sipping on a warm, slightly unsavory brew, hoping against hope it would alleviate that rattling cough. Historians still argue whether some medieval medical practices, despite their lack of scientific basis, offered psychological comfort and placebo effects that genuinely aided in recovery, or if they were largely ineffective and sometimes even harmful. But when you're desperate, you try anything. The long nights of winter also brought a profound sense of isolation and gloom. With travel difficult and days short, the world shrank to the confines of your village, your hovel, and your own weary thoughts. The lack of sunlight contributed to a phenomenon we now understand as seasonal affective disorder, SAD, a form of depression linked to reduced light exposure. While not explicitly recognized or diagnosed in medieval times, the pervasive low spirits and lethargy during winter would have been a common experience. You'd feel the weight of the endless darkness, the seemingly interminable wait for spring, a silent burden carried by everyone in the community. The cold, you see, wasn't just physical, it burrowed into the mind, chilling the spirit as much as the flesh. The rhythm of medieval peasant life was inextricably linked to the seasonal cycles, and nowhere was this more apparent than in the meticulous preparations for, and adaptations to, winter. This wasn't just a season. It was a looming challenge that dictated every decision, every chore, every waking moment. You didn't just wake up one morning and decide it was winter. You felt its approach in the shortening days, the crisping air, the subtle shift in the light. As summer's warmth began to wane, the pace of life would intensify. The harvest was the absolute zenith of your year, a frantic race against time to bring in the crops before the first killing frost. Every hand, from the youngest child to the oldest elder, would be pressed into service. This wasn't just about food for eating now. It was about laying down stores for the long, lean months ahead. Grains would be threshed and stored in granaries or large bins. Root vegetables carefully buried in earthen pits or cellars to protect them from freezing, and any surplus meat would be salted or smoked for preservation. You'd feel the urgency in the air, the collective anxiety that permeated the village if the harvest was poor or if unexpected rains threatened to rot the crops in the field. After the harvest came the crucial period of winter preparations. This meant a renewed focus on gathering every last bit of fuel, the deadwood from the forest, the dried dung from the fields, the peat from the bog. You'd also make sure your livestock were healthy, perhaps even slaughtering some animals that wouldn't make it through the winter, preserving their meat, and ensuring there was enough fodder for the survivors. Any repairs to your hovel, patching up holes in the thatch or cracks in the daub, would need to be completed before the deep freezes set in. You'd check your simple tools, mend your worn clothing, and prepare your animal hides for additional bedding. It was a race against the calendar, a frantic push to secure every possible advantage against the impending chill. A mainstream historical fact here is that crop failures, often exacerbated by the colder, wetter conditions of the Little Ice Age, were the primary cause of famine in medieval Europe. A single bad harvest could plunge an entire region into starvation, making the meticulous planning and execution of autumn tasks absolutely critical for survival. The relationship between climate, agriculture, and human survival was stark and immediate. For a quirky tidbit, some peasant communities would hold specific autumn stocking up fairs or markets where they would trade surpluses, buy essential goods like salt, crucial for preservation, or acquire tools. These weren't just commercial events. They were also social gatherings, a chance to share information, commiserate about the coming winter, and perhaps even exchange folk remedies for ailments. Imagine the bustling energy, the haggling over prices, the smell of curing meats and damp earth, all underscored by the knowledge that this might be your last chance to get vital supplies before the snows cut off communication. Historians still argue whether the cyclical nature of medieval peasant life fostered a resilient fatalism or a proactive sense of community self-reliance. But for you, the peasant, this annual rhythm was your lifeblood. You understood, intimately, that your survival depended on your foresight and your labor during the brief windows of opportunity that the seasons afforded. When the first heavy snowfall came, a profound sense of either satisfaction or anxiety would wash over you. If your stores were adequate, if your hovel was as sealed as it could be, you could face the long winter nights with a grim determination. If not, the gnawing worry of hunger and cold would be a constant companion, a heavy burden carried through every waking hour. The seasons weren't just a backdrop. They were the very stage upon which your daily drama of survival unfolded, constantly pushing you, constantly demanding your absolute best. Beyond the tangible preparations of food, fuel, and shelter, medieval peasants also relied on a fascinating tapestry of local lore and superstitions to navigate the uncertainties of winter. While these beliefs might seem quaint or irrational to our modern, scientifically minded brains, for them, they offered a sense of control, a way to interpret the unpredictable forces of nature, and perhaps a small flicker of hope in the face of overwhelming odds. Imagine your grandmother, a wise old woman with eyes that have seen too many harsh winters, recounting tales by the flickering firelight. You'd hear about various omens signaling a severe winter. If you saw the first autumn leaves falling early, or if bears were seen foraging more aggressively than usual, these were whispers from nature, hints that you needed to prepare for an extra cold season. Remember how they'd look at the thickness of an animal's coat or the amount of straw a pig carried. These weren't just practical observations. They often carried a superstitious weight, signs from the animal kingdom about the severity of the coming chill. One common belief involved predicting snow based on the behavior of birds. If flocks of birds, especially migratory ones, lingered longer than usual, or if they seemed particularly agitated, it was taken as a sign of heavy snow or deep freezes approaching. The idea was that the birds, closer to nature, sensed the change in the air pressure or the subtle shifts in temperature that humans couldn't yet perceive. You might find yourself gazing up at the sky, anxiously watching the patterns of the last remaining swallows, hoping they wouldn't be around too long. A mainstream historical fact here is that folklore and superstitious beliefs were deeply embedded in medieval daily life, often serving as a means to understand and cope with a world that was largely unpredictable and inexplicable through rational means. These beliefs provided comfort, guidance, and a framework for interpreting natural phenomena, even if they lacked scientific validity. They were a vital part of the cultural fabric. For a quirky tidbit, there was a widespread belief that burning specific types of wood on particular days or in certain arrangements could bring good luck or ward off bad weather. For example, some traditions suggested that burning wood from a specific tree, like an ash or an oak, on the winter solstice could ensure the return of warmth and fertility, or that keeping a certain kind of branch above your doorway would prevent evil spirits, and perhaps the biting wind itself, from entering your home. Imagine carefully selecting a piece of wood, whispering a small prayer, and placing it just so on the embers, genuinely believing it would make a difference. Historians still argue whether such ritualistic practices were purely superstitious or if they inadvertently reinforced practical habits, like meticulous wood collection, by imbuing them with spiritual significance. Beyond specific omens, there was a general sense that appeasing various spirits or natural forces could influence the winter's severity. You might participate in small, local rituals, perhaps leaving a portion of your harvest as an offering to the spirits of the land, or performing simple charms to encourage the sun's return. These weren't grand, church-sanctioned ceremonies. They were quiet, personal acts, woven into the fabric of daily life. The medieval mind was one that saw the world as alive, populated by unseen forces, and you, as a peasant, knew that sometimes a little bit of magic, or at least a strong belief in it, was as important as any physical preparation. You might find yourself muttering an old rhyme under your breath as you banked the fire, or making a small cross with your finger in the ashes, just in case it truly helped keep the chill away. It's a testament to the human need for meaning, even in the harshest of circumstances, to find comfort and a sense of agency in a world often beyond your control. While the majority of our medieval journey has focused on the everyday peasant, it's worth taking a momentary detour into a different kind of existence during the medieval winter, the monastery. For those who chose a life of religious devotion, the chill of winter presented its own unique set of challenges and, surprisingly, some unexpected comforts that set them apart from their peasant brethren. Imagine yourself as a monk or nun in a medieval monastery. Your days are structured by prayer, work, and study, but the cold is still a pervasive presence. Monasteries, especially older ones, were often built of stone, which, while durable and imposing, is also incredibly good at retaining cold. So, while you might be spared the wattle and daub drafts of a peasant hovel, you'd still feel a deep, penetrating cold radiating from the thick walls of the cloisters, the chapel, and your cell. The echoing stone corridors would amplify the chill, making it feel even more profound. Heat in a monastery was often concentrated in specific areas. The warming room, or calefactory, was typically the only heated room in the entire complex, other than the kitchen. This would be a communal space where monks or nuns could go to thaw out, warm their hands, and dry their damp habits. Imagine the palpable relief as you step into this room, feeling the blessed warmth after hours of silent prayer in a frigid chapel. Fires in the kale factory would be carefully managed, precious fuel conserved, but for those brief moments, it offered respite. Your personal cell, if you even had one to yourself, would likely be unheated and spartan. You'd sleep on a simple bed, perhaps with straw or wool, wrapped in scratchy woolen blankets, just like the peasants. The difference, however, often lay in the quality and quantity of these items, as monasteries, with their greater resources, could sometimes provide slightly better provisions. A mainstream historical fact is that monasteries played a crucial role in preserving knowledge and culture during the Middle Ages, often acting as centers of literacy and scholarship. Despite the physical hardships, the intellectual and spiritual life within their walls continued, even through the harshest winters. The very act of copying manuscripts, often with ink freezing in the quill, speaks to an incredible dedication. For a quirky tidbit, some monastic orders, particularly those with stricter rules, would engage in practices like cold bathing or refraining from warm garments as a form of asceticism, a deliberate embrace of hardship to purify the spirit. While this certainly wouldn't help with warmth, it highlights a different approach to dealing with the cold, not just surviving it, but actively engaging with it as part of a spiritual discipline. Imagine plunging into icy water in the depths of winter, all for the sake of your soul. Historians still argue whether the extreme asceticism practiced by some medieval monks and hermits was driven purely by religious conviction, or if it was also a way to gain social influence and demonstrate spiritual superiority within a highly religious society. But for you, the monk shivering in your cell, the cold was simply another companion on your path to salvation. Despite the cold stone and the austere lifestyle, there was a certain kind of warmth found in the monastery. The warmth of routine, community, and shared purpose. The chanting in the chapel, the shared meals in the refectory, the quiet camaraderie of shared labor. These elements created a different kind of heat, a spiritual and emotional comfort that could, perhaps, transcend the physical chill. You would find warmth in the shared breath of prayer, the collective voices rising in unison, echoing through the cold stone. It wasn't the warmth of a roaring fire, but the steady, enduring warmth of fellowship and unwavering faith, a quiet strength that helped you endure the long, silent nights, knowing you were part of something larger and more enduring than the winter's bite. Having explored the humble peasant hovel and the austere monastery, let's now ascend the social ladder, ever so slightly, to consider how the lord or baron fared during the medieval winter. You might imagine opulent luxury, blazing fires, and endless feasts. And while it was certainly a step up from peasant life, don't picture a modern, centrally heated mansion. Even for the elite, the medieval castle or manor house, while grand, was still a fundamentally drafty, chilly place. Imagine yourself as a baron, or perhaps the lady of the castle. Your dwelling, a massive stone structure, boasts thick walls and towering ceilings. Sounds impressive, right? But those thick stone walls, while formidable against invaders, are excellent conductors of cold. They absorb the outdoor chill and radiate it inward, making for a perpetually cool interior. Your windows might be larger than a peasant's, perhaps even featuring some primitive glass in the highest status rooms, but many would still be covered with oiled parchment or wooden shutters, offering limited light and even less insulation. Drafts, those omnipresent medieval companions, would whistle through ill-fitting doors and arrow slits. Heating, though more robust than a peasant's hearth, still centered around fireplaces. You would have multiple fireplaces throughout the castle, in the Great Hall, the Lord's Chambers, and perhaps a few other key rooms. These would be much grander, with proper chimneys to vent smoke, a significant improvement over the peasant's smoky hovel. However, these large fireplaces, while consuming vast quantities of wood, were often inefficient, with much of the heat escaping up the chimney. The sheer volume of the rooms meant that only areas directly adjacent to the fire would feel truly warm. You might find yourself constantly moving closer to the hearth, or positioning your chair to catch the maximum warmth, even in your own supposedly luxurious chambers. A mainstream historical fact is that castle design evolved significantly over the medieval period, often prioritizing defense and status over comfort and warmth. Later medieval castles sometimes incorporated more refined heating systems like hypocausts. Underfloor heating, though rare and expensive, or larger, more efficient fireplaces, but these were exceptions rather than the norm for most of the era. The constant balancing act between security and livability was paramount. For a quirky tidbit, noble households sometimes employed servants specifically tasked with carrying braziers of hot coals from room to provide temporary, localized warmth, or to warm specific objects like beds before the lord or lady retired for the night. Imagine a small, glowing charcoal burner being carefully ferried through a cold, echoing corridor, a fleeting island of heat in the vast chill. It's like having personal, mobile space heaters, but requiring constant manual labor. Historians still argue whether the apparent lack of advanced heating technology in medieval castles was due to a genuine absence of knowledge, or if the abundance of cheap labor and fuel made more complex systems simply unnecessary or not cost-effective. But for you, the Baron, while you certainly wouldn't be freezing, you'd still be aware of the constant battle against the chill, even within your imposing walls. Despite the relative comforts, life in a medieval castle during winter still involved a degree of stoicism. You wouldn't be sleeping under a down comforter. Your bedding, while better quality than a peasant's, would still be thick wool, linen, and perhaps fur, piled high to trap warmth. Servants might bring you warmed wine or spiced ale to help ward off the chill. While peasants worried about survival, lords worried about prestige, managing their estates, and perhaps the constant grumble of their own slightly chilly stomach after a winter's feast. You would still feel the pervasive cold, perhaps less acutely than a peasant, but still a constant presence, a reminder that even wealth and status couldn't entirely conquer the medieval winter. You might occasionally shiver as a gust of wind found its way through a gap in the stone, and for a fleeting moment, you'd perhaps acknowledge the raw, elemental power of the cold that affected every soul, from the lowliest serf to the mightiest lord. We've journeyed deep into the medieval past, experiencing the biting cold through the eyes of peasants, monks, and even lords. But now, as we gently drift back towards your present, let's consider something rather intriguing: the modern echoes of medieval cold. You might be surprised how some of those ancient struggles against the chill aren't entirely consigned to history books, even in our technologically advanced world. Think about that moment when your power goes out during a winter storm. Suddenly, your perfectly regulated home becomes a cold box. The furnace stops humming, the lights dim, and that comfortable warmth begins to seep away, replaced by an unfamiliar chill. You bundle up, perhaps light candles, and maybe even start to think about how long the outage will last. For a few hours, or even a day, you get a tiny, unsettling glimpse into the constant, pervasive cold that was the norm for medieval people. No instant heat, no hot shower, just the slow, inevitable creep of low temperatures. Or consider less dramatic scenarios. Perhaps you live in an older home, one with drafty windows or poor insulation. You might find yourself piling on blankets, wearing extra sweaters indoors, or even using a space heater to create a small island of warmth in a larger, chilly room. This is your personal, modern-day version of the medieval peasant's constant battle against drafts, trying to make the most of limited heat within a larger, less-than-ideal structure. You're effectively creating your own little hearthside microclimate. A mainstream historical fact that becomes starkly relevant here is that energy poverty remains a significant issue globally, even today. Millions of people, whether in developing countries or within wealthy nations, still lack access to reliable, affordable heating, forcing them to rely on less efficient, more dangerous methods for warmth, echoing the struggles of their medieval predecessors. The fight against cold is not a relic of the past for everyone. For a quirky tidbit, think about the popularity of hygge or cozy aesthetics in modern design and lifestyle trends. It's all about warm blankets, flickering candles, oversized mugs of hot beverages, and crackling fireplaces, real or digital. While pitched as a trend, isn't it, at its core, an almost primal yearning for the very comforts that medieval people strove for, but rarely achieved on a daily basis. We romanticize the very things that were essential, often brutal, necessities for them. Historians still argue whether this modern fascination with coziness is a subconscious collective memory of past hardships, or simply a universal human desire for comfort regardless of historical context. But you can't help but chuckle at how we now pay to replicate an environment that medieval people desperately tried to escape. Even your choice of winter clothing subtly reflects medieval strategies. You reach for that chunky wool sweater, those insulated boots, the warm hat that covers your ears. These are direct descendants of the functional, layered garments that medieval peasants relied upon. We've certainly improved the materials and designs, making them lighter, less itchy, and more effective, but the core principle, trapping air, layering natural fibers, remains unchanged. So, as you lie there, warm and comfortable, perhaps with a soft hum from your heating system, take a moment to appreciate how far we've come. But also acknowledge that faint echo, that subtle understanding of what it means to truly feel the cold, to fight against it with every available resource. The medieval peasant's daily struggle against the chill, while seemingly distant, has surprisingly persistent whispers in our modern lives, reminding us of the fundamental human need for warmth and shelter, a need that transcends centuries and technologies. As our journey through the chilling realities of medieval winter draws to a close, let's reflect on the profound, unseen impact that this relentless cold had, not just on the physical survival, but on the very mindset and culture of the people. It wasn't just a season, it was a deeply ingrained aspect of life that shaped everything from daily habits to long-term planning, leaving a lingering legacy you might still feel today. The constant struggle against the cold fostered an incredible sense of resourcefulness and resilience. Every peasant, every villager, became an expert in making do with what they had. You learned to mend rather than replace, to save rather than waste, to find a use for every scrap of material. The idea of waste not, want not, wasn't a quaint proverb. It was a survival mantra, born from generations of hard-won knowledge in an unforgiving climate. This practical ingenuity, forged in the fires of necessity, literally, became a fundamental character trait. It also cultivated a deep and abiding respect for the natural world, even as it presented immense challenges. You learned to read the subtle signs of nature, the changing winds, the behavior of animals, the texture of the soil, because your life depended on understanding them. The weather wasn't just something to comment on. It was an active force, a partner in your daily existence, demanding constant attention and adaptation. This intimate relationship with the land, though often harsh, created a connection that is largely lost in our urbanized, climate-controlled world. A mainstream historical fact here is that communal bonds and mutual aid were far stronger in medieval peasant communities than in many modern societies, partly out of necessity. The harshness of life, especially during winter, meant that cooperation was not just beneficial but absolutely essential for survival. A sick neighbor couldn't be left to freeze. A family with a failed harvest needed assistance. This fostered a deep sense of interdependence. For a quirky tidbit, consider the concept of winter storytelling. With long, dark nights and little to do outdoors, the medieval winter was a time for oral traditions to flourish. Families and communities would gather by the hearth, sharing tales, legends, and histories. These stories, often passed down through generations, weren't just entertainment. They reinforced cultural values, provided lessons for survival, and helped to fill the oppressive darkness with the warmth of shared human connection. It was a way to chase away the gloom, not with physical heat, but with the warmth of narrative. Historians still argue whether the prevalence of mythological creatures and supernatural tales in medieval folklore was a direct reflection of the period's harsh realities and dangers, or if it simply represented universal human impulses for imaginative expression. But for you, the peasant listening to these stories, they offered a welcome escape, a temporary reprieve from the gnawing cold. The cold also instilled a profound patience and a long-term perspective. You didn't plan for next week, you planned for next winter. Every summer's toil, every autumn's harvest, was undertaken with the bitter chill of the coming months in mind. This foresight, this ingrained habit of preparing for the worst, shaped decisions across generations. It taught a certain stoicism, a quiet acceptance of hardship, coupled with an unwavering will to endure. So, as you now lie in your own comfortable space, perhaps feeling the last whispers of tonight's journey, take a moment to truly appreciate the warmth you have. It's not just about the modern conveniences, but but about the culmination of centuries of human ingenuity and sheer grit in the face of nature's raw power. The medieval peasant, fighting tooth and nail against the pervasive chill, laid the groundwork for the comforts we now often take for granted. Their resilience, their ingenuity, and their enduring spirit against the cold continue to echo, subtly, in the way we prepare for winter, in the stories we tell, and in our fundamental appreciation for that most basic, yet most vital, of human needs: warmth. The story fades now, like the last embers of a carefully banked medieval fire. The whispers of ancient winters grow softer, blending into the quiet hum of your own warm room. Feel the comfort of your blankets, the steady beat of your own heart, warm and content. Let the distant echoes of their struggles transform into a gentle lullaby, a testament to endurance and the preciousness of warmth. Close your eyes, let your breath deepen, and allow yourself to drift into a peaceful, deeply comfortable sleep, free from the biting cold of centuries past. Sweet dreams. End of script. Sweet dreams.